Hello, I'm Tyler McCann, the Managing Director at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Thank you for joining this Ag Policy Exchange webinar today. The Ag Policy Exchange webinar series is an opportunity for us to dive deeper into some important debates and discussions that we need in this sector. Certainly the one today is timely, coming after the meetings last week of federal, provincial, territorial agricultural ministers, where I think that we'll get into this, there was either enough, too little, too much debate and dialogue that happened. Today's webinar and our work is often made possible by the support of the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada under the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnerships Agri-Competitiveness Program. Probably worth noting that in today that's a bit of a declaration of a conflict of interest, but we do appreciate the support that we've got and the freedom that we have to operate as a result of the partnership that we have with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. We're also pleased that today's webinar is part of our ongoing partnership with Real Agriculture, and it's great to have Shaun and Kelvin from Real Agriculture participating today. Please take the time, if you're interested in more of our work, to go to the CAPI website, sign up for our newsletter, and also go to the realagriculture.com website where you can sign up for their ag policy newsletter that hit inboxes today and covered some of the important topics that we're going to be talking about today. It's an important opportunity to get into this, and we'll get some good in-depth discussions, but what we want to do is to start from hearing from you, our audience. So we'll start with a poll question today, and we want to start the stage by asking you, what kind of change does the Halifax Statement signal for the next policy framework? We're giving you the chance to tell us that it's transformative, that it's incremental, it represents the status quo, or it's too early to tell, or that it's negative. I think that what we've seen over the last couple of days is differences of opinions and something that is up for debate and discussion. And we're going to get into what this really means and what this looks like. Certainly, the Halifax Statement is the directional statement. We know that it was not intended to be a very detailed analysis, that much of the details do need to be worked out between the federal government and the provinces, but this is a chance to see more. So 41% of those of you who answered the question say that it's too early to tell. Negative is got the fewest answers that are there. Status quo and incremental are very similar at the end of the day. So we will now get into the substantive discussion today. And that's going to start with an interview that happened. But before we get into the interview, I want to take a minute to remind everyone to take the time to register for CAPI's 2026 Exchange Conference. That's happening October 6th and 7th in Ottawa. Our theme this year is Canadian Agri-Food in a Value-Added World. We put out an e-blast recently highlighting that for 1 week only, you can save 10% on the registration. There is a link in the chat to register. And so with that, let's get ready and dive into it. What we want to do is take the time to hear from an interview that Real Agriculture's Kelvin Heppner did with Minister MacDonald yesterday. So we'll share that. We'll listen to about 10 minutes of the interview. It's a longer 20-minute pre-recorded interview. Take the time to go to the Real Agriculture website to listen to that interview when you have the chance. And when we come back from the interview with Kelvin and Minister MacDonald, it will be the time for Shaun Haney from realagriculture.com to take over and take us into the next part of the interview. So with that, if technology cooperates, we will now share the interview between Kelvin Heppner and Minister Heath MacDonald.
Agriculture ministers from across Canada agreed on and published the Halifax Statement coming out of their annual meeting in Halifax last week, and it outlines the direction for the next 5-year ag policy framework. And joining us now to discuss this statement and the direction coming out of that meeting in Halifax, we're pleased to welcome the Federal Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food, Heath MacDonald, back in his home riding in PEI. Thanks, Minister MacDonald, for taking time to join us again.
It's nice to be here, Kelvin.
The FPT meeting in Halifax last week, we've had a few days now to digest maybe what was discussed, what was talked about, the outcomes from the meeting in your view as co-chair, along with Minister Morrill from Nova Scotia. What do you see as the big accomplishments from the Halifax meeting?
Well, I think that, first of all, just the unity among the ministers across the country, I think is extremely important, having those face-to-face. We even talked about maybe doing it more than once a year. So I think that's important to develop those relationships and understand the regionality and the differences between the provinces. But I think some of the biggest changes that we introduced, put on the table were, the BRM programs. We agreed to change the BRM. We introduced an arm's length labor and contract work for eligibility. I think everybody agreed to. Of course, everybody has to go back to their home provinces and talk to their finance ministers relative to the investment each province wants to make on that. But we also talked about increasing the cap from 3 to 6 million when the next national policy framework comes to forth in 2028. So I think that's something that we agreed to. But the arm's length labor and the contract work, Kelvin, I think we agreed to hopefully have that ready by the spring of 2027.
Okay, so that would take effect next year. The increase to the agri stability cap, that would be under the next framework that would take effect. That would be further down the road.
That's what we agreed to. Yes.
Okay. So of course, at the conclusion of the meeting, the ministers agreed, and you published the Halifax Statement as it's known, setting the direction. There's a list of 4 priorities for the next ag policy framework, and that's what a lot of people traveled to Halifax last week to be part of this discussion, because it was expected to shape the direction for Canadian ag policy for the near to medium future, I'd say, medium term. When you look at the Halifax Statement versus what we had before, the Guelph Statement that set the direction for our current ag policy framework, how is the Halifax Statement different? How is the direction changing when we look at what the next policy framework might look like?
Well, I think, like, we talked a lot about trade diversification, which was part of my mandate when I first started and continues to be. Red tape reduction is something that I think is ongoing, but I think we had a presentation done, and I think people were satisfied that we're moving in the right direction. Regulatory alignment, realignment, I guess I should say, with a couple of like CFIA and PDA. I think it's important that we make these changes, and I think it's certainly, we live in a different time even than from 5 years ago, and I don't even think it's comparable to what we're seeing today, whether it's climatic issues or geopolitical issues. I think farmers are on the front lines and battling hard each and every day. They're resilient. Just to be a farmer, you have to be resilient, but they're being introduced to challenges, and I think governments, policymakers at every level have to understand that when we're making decisions. And I think making sure that they're heard on the next policy framework is something that's extremely important to me personally. I think, we've traveled across this country and we did meetings in every province, territories, most of them, I'd say 90%, 95% in person, which, it's a big undertaking, but it certainly gives you a perspective of, how times are different, even from 3 years ago, let alone 5 years ago. I mean, we all know what we're dealing with.
Okay. Some people have questioned why there wasn't more reference to the context and how the context has changed from 5 years ago when it comes to Canadian agriculture. Of course, as you alluded to, many ways not even comparable to the situation we were in 5 years ago. The trade environment, of course, has changed. As with further developments this week with the threat of these 50% tariffs in less than a month now. National priorities have also changed when it comes to driving the economy. Cost of living is a high priority. Why were these challenges not explicitly acknowledged or more specifically referred to in the statement in the direction set for the next 5 years?
Well, I think we just invested 3.2 billion in a national food security strategy, which we had at length discussions on the opportunities within that program and how that ties into the Halifax Statement, basically on what we as ministers can leverage for within our provinces and producers and farmers right down to the farm gate. So I think there's been all kinds of, look, I mean, you could spend 10 pages written on a statement, and to me, it's the action that we need to take. So I don't get too stressed on what's in the statement or what's not in the statement. I can tell you, if you talk to any minister, we had some tremendous meetings. And, I have to give a lot of credit to Mr. Murrow, the minister responsible for Nova Scotia, for putting putting a lot of work into this, him and his team. I think everybody came there with, their priorities, obviously, their impediments. And they also talked a little bit about the opportunities within their provinces. So I think the unity around that table is extremely strong. I think we have some really good experienced people. We have some new people with new ideas as well, even the northern communities. So I think we're at a good point in agriculture. We have momentum. I think we have good momentum. Hopefully, we can come out the other side of these trade wars a lot better than we went in. But I think unity is certainly something that we all talked about, and how important it is to stick together, no matter what your color, where you come from. I think we're all just there trying to do the right thing.
So if the text of the Halifax Statement, Minister, and the text of the Guelph Statement look largely similar, and it looks in some ways, I think it's fair to describe it as status quo, not a whole lot of change. Do we expect that change to come in the implementation of the Halifax Statement? Can we expect there to be some of that momentum carry through into updates, into revisions to programs, into new ideas coming forward, receiving funding, receiving priority from the federal and provincial governments?
Most certainly, I think, even with those, it was the federal government that first initiated the arm's length labor and contract work. It was something that I was hearing across the country that needed to change. We've seen in the National Food Security Strategy about generational farming and ensuring that young farmers have the opportunity to take over family farms without too much burden on their parents. We've seen regulatory changes through CFIA and PDA. That's also in the National Food Security Strategy. We've seen competition rules being endorsed or hopefully enforced with additional funding in there. So we're trying to pull as many levers as possible to ensure that farmers are successful. And I'll tell you, I mean, they feed us, and you can't lose sight of that. And I think a lot of people tend to overlook the importance of farmers in this country. And I think, I've said the story before, when you go to the grocery store and see that something's missing off the shelf, you get all worked up and said, why is that not here? Well, maybe there was a forest fire in the area that produces chicken, or maybe there was a hurricane that went through that we can't get the product to market, or something to that effect. I mean, there's a lot of things that happen that are out of our control to some extent. So we need to control what we can control. And I think along with the Halifax Statement, along with the changes to the BRM programs, along with the National Food Security Strategy, I think we're going in the right direction. And I think we have momentum, and I'll say it again, and I think we need to keep it. So I look forward to the next few months. I think we have some real opportunities, and we need to capitalize on them too. I think, there's a silver lining in all of this, and it's certainly putting a lens on agriculture and agri-food. It shouldn't have to, but it does, and it is. And I think we need to talk more about it, but we also need to take the opportunity to make sure that we're making changes when things are somewhat good, I think, is safe to say, because I think you make bad decisions when you're desperate, and we're not desperate. We have good momentum, and I think we're going in the right direction.
Great stuff. I want to thank Minister MacDonald for making himself available for that interview with Kelvin. And if you want to listen to the full discussion with Minister Heath MacDonald, Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food, you can go to realagriculture.com and check that out. If you do have questions throughout the webinar, we're going to try to get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. Please put them in the Q&A box, and I will try to facilitate those as much as possible. Before we get to our panel discussion here, we do have a second poll question. And the question is, what should be the priority for implementation? We just heard from the minister talking about momentum and need to capitalize. Is it increasing federal and provincial spending, simplifying and consolidating programs to direct existing funding to higher priorities, subsidizing price insurance and offering choice in the new risk management tools, or encouraging greater provincial flexibility? Or finally, increasing policy and program support for innovation. So please vote now. Okay, appreciate everybody that voted. And the number one answer with 38% was actually the last option, which is increasing policy and program support for innovation at 38%. 31% was simplifying and consolidating programs to direct existing funding to higher priority, so making more of a choice. And the least was actually subsidizing price insurance and offering choice in new risk management tools. Interesting, because a lot of times BRM and risk management takes up a lot of the oxygen in the room when we are talking about the ag policy framework there. So that being the lowest choice of our attendees to the webinar here. Now we're going to move into the panel discussion portion of the webinar. Now, our panelists for today are Scott Ross, Andrea Brocklebank, Greg Meredith, and Tyler McCann. I'm going to introduce them, and I got a question for them to lead off here quickly. Our first panelist is Scott Ross. Scott is the Executive Director of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, leading advocacy efforts for Canadian farmers. He brings extensive experience in agricultural policy, stakeholder engagement, and industry collaboration. On the Wednesday in Halifax, CFA and Scott and his team hosted the CFA policy summit and roundtable. Was great. If you weren't in Halifax, you can listen to last Wednesday's episode of Real Ag Radio, which we recorded from the stage, which was a lot of fun. So, hey Scott, how's it going?
Good, Shaun. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. There's a ton of stuff to talk about here. Off the top, you heard what Mr. MacDonald said there. Going into last week, what were your and CFA's expectations? What was your ask? What did you want to see happen?
Well, I think there was two things in particular. The first being focused on core priorities around growth, competitiveness, resilience, innovation, market diversification, and a real focus on accountability. And I think when you look at the statement, we do see a lot of that alignment and a little more focus than previously. I recognize the context around the status quo being largely maintained, but I think really what the sector was calling for was focus on those core priorities. But I think that the second expectation was a real reflection of an urgency around the need to do things differently. And I think that's an area where we have our work cut out for us still. And there's a lot more to be discussed, as we saw in those survey results around devil's going to be in the details. And we have some work cut out for us in terms of whether that's looking at novel approaches to risk management, clarifying a vision for innovation and how we're going to advance that as a sector. Really, there was an expectation, I think, in light of that context that we just heard referenced and the change we've seen over the last 5 years, that we see the framework adapt accordingly. And I think that's an area where we still have a lot to discuss.
Yeah, it still feels a little bit sticky, like we're maybe caught in first gear a little bit. We're trying to grind those gears in the truck a little bit to get to something a little bit different in the status quo. Scott, we're going to come back to you, of course, a part of the more general panel discussion. Next up, we've got Andrea Brocklebank, our second panelist. And Andrea is the CEO of the Canadian Cattle Association, formerly Executive Director of the Beef Cattle Research Council. She has led industry research, knowledge mobilization, and strategic partnerships supporting Canadian beef. Andrea, it's great to see you.
Good to see you.
Okay, so what were your expectations going into last week?
Well, I think much like Scott, we have our key priorities related to BRM programs, innovation, all of those things. Market growth is another big focus, and competitiveness, regulatory reduction, and all of the right words were said. And I think we were expecting those to be said, but it really comes down to there's a lot of details. When I was looking at your poll, I probably would have ranked as incremental. There's some nice things said in there. We heard on the BRM, changes to the egg stability cap. Equitable and responsive programs is one thing we targeted in on because that speaks to our ask around livestock price insurance. But it still feels a long ways out in terms of actually committing to those things. So I think that's where we're really looking for what the actual activity is. And likewise on things like innovation, we've seen cuts to research. And so we've really been advocating these programs need to actually supplement that and address some of that. And so when we look at what the statement said, I think, we're happy to see those things covered, but we want to see the depth and breadth and honestly a bit more willingness to be to address the current market dynamics with volatility and climate being issues. We want to make sure that we're being aggressive on these things, not just status quo.
Yeah, well put. Okay, we'll come back to Andrea.
Mm-hmm.
I think, as I read some of the pillars, and what was in that Halifax letter, people aren't going to disagree with what is said there. It's the details, the underneath that is, I think, has left some people, one side of the opinion equation here, a little bit feeling there is a gap. Let's move on to
For
our
sure.
next panelist. It is Greg Meredith, and Greg was a senior official in global affairs and Agriculture Canada, and more recently was deputy minister in several Ontario ministries, including Agriculture, Economic Development and Trade, and Labor, Immigration, Training, Skills, and Development. We got to get some of these department names a little bit shorter. He has proven a record of transformational change and significant achievement in agricultural policy, regulatory affairs, and international trade. Greg, great to chat with you again.
Hi there, Shaun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I just want to also mention to everybody that there's a longer form interview that Lindsay Smith, editor of RealAgriculture.com, did with Greg. That is in that Ag Policy e-newsletter that went out actually today. Everybody can check that out at our website. So, Greg, your thoughts? What would you like to see happen here as I think more in the past going into this meeting last week?
Right. Well, look, I think the minister is quite right that, they did address some elements of what the sector considers quite essential. Some parameter changes in agri-stability that are important for on-farm dollars and cents types of issues. But really, my take on the meeting and the statement, Shaun, is it was a steady as she goes, kind of nuts and bolts type of statement, very much a continuation of past practice. And in some circumstances, I think that would be okay. But you know what? A lot of what they achieved at that meeting could be done by officials and ministers on any given day. It doesn't have to be captured in a statement. These are the kinds of things that I think ministers and officials need to get on with on a day-to-day basis. I would have expected ministers to spend a bit more time on what has changed in the environment since the last framework. And none of us, I think, are blind to what I would call a maelstrom of trade, economic, and political and geopolitical storms around Canada and the world right now. It isn't steady as she goes in the environment that we're living in now. The announcement just a few days ago of 50% tariffs and some strategically important sectors for Canada announced by the United States is just another indication of just how volatile the market is that we're working in and the political environment is that we're working in. I would have expected ministers to say more of the same is probably not going to be adequate for the sector. It's not going to meet the sector's needs, big picture. And I think there was an opportunity, maybe I say missed, not lost, because there's lots of time before the next framework to address some of these issues. But I think there was an opportunity missed to elevate the discussion around agriculture to a more nation building status. I think it's, like I say, really important to get the nuts and bolts, the on-farm cash related issues, get them right and get them implemented quickly. But there's a bigger challenge facing the sector, I think, and facing Canada. I think there's an opportunity to make ministers more mindful of the potential that agriculture offers for Canada in this kind of environment. If you talk about the food security strategy, for example, there's a lot of elements of really interesting new directions in that strategy, but the strategy did not come up as a core part of this discussion. And so that gave me the impression that the sort of Fed Prov elements of agriculture and agricultural priorities and the federal government's priorities with respect to the food security strategy really aren't meshed as tightly as they should be. So in short, I thought there was some progress made on some important elements, and it is important that officials and ministers get together regularly on this kind of thing to make sure that farmers are being well served. But there's an opportunity missed to really elevate the discussion around agriculture as a nation building sector and as a nation building strategy.
Yeah, well put. Let's bring everybody all in together, and I'll bring in our fourth panelist, the no stranger to this group. Started off the webinar. It is Tyler McCann. He's managing director at CAPI. And as everybody rejoins us here, Tyler, anything that the other three panelists said that you want to add to in terms of what you were looking for heading into this meeting?
So I think one of the things that we had tried to do as part of a number of different projects we're working on is advance kind of some directional things that governments could do. And I think that there was some hope that there would be some acknowledgement that we have an innovation problem. We know that an innovation strategy wasn't going to come out of the meeting, but it would have been nice to see some acknowledgement that governments will work on an innovation strategy. We talked about risk management earlier. I think that would have been nice to see some acknowledgement that they were considering significant reforms or at least a more meaningful policy discussion on it. We had advanced some pieces around that. But I think, Shaun, one of the things that I've been reflecting on since is that going into the meeting, we certainly had low expectations. That I think everybody understood. Governments were relatively clear when you would talk to people at the federal and provincial government that this was going to be a status quo type of statement. I'll say I think it was more status quo than I had expected it was going to be. But in hindsight, I've been reflecting more on why did we all have such low expectations? It's not clear to me that the context justifies low expectations. We've got, I think, a federal government, provincial governments, they all seem relatively well aligned. Everybody seems to agree that we're in a challenging context. Everybody seems to agree that kind of better is possible, that we could do more, that we need more focus. To see that, I think, not really reflected in the statement is a bit of surprise. And I just don't know why we all just let our expectations be as low as they were going into the meeting.
So, Scott, I'll jump over to you on that. We heard the minister say the word unity 3-4 times. And I think curious, do you agree with this statement? Unity trumped everything, in the sense where unity became, it seems to be the priority coming out of the Halifax letter over dealing with some of the other things that maybe some of the panelists have mentioned here.
Yeah, there's a couple, thoughts I have on that. One, I think the nature of the way the framework is developed and negotiated does lend itself to path dependency. I think it becomes much more challenging to make substantive change than it is to continue going the path you are. And I think that's a critical element of this that we need to really reflect upon. I also think what's clear now, and I think has been clear for some time, is given some of the longer timelines we're seeing in some of the communique around potential future changes, we really need to seize the moment now and not wait for 5 more years to pass. I think it's a really clarion call to the industry that these kind of conversations can't wait till the negotiations are formalized. We need to keep the conversation going right away. But I also think part of that is there's a process in play here where we start with a statement that's high level and priorities, and then we get into the program structure. And I think everyone has sort of bought into that premise. And I think by virtue of that, yes, I think the industry did a much better job, and we were really seized with that, of trying to clarify our common priorities. But we now have that harder lift to do in a very short period of time, which is when you get down to the substance of it, can we come to that same level of clarity around what our priorities are with respect to actual program reform? And I think there's some good ideas that have been put in the window, but I think we as an industry need to hold governments accountable by being clear on what those short list of priorities are and not get lost in the weeds on that. I also think longer term, there's a question here around, what Greg said around nation building. And I think we as a sector still have a big job to do in front of us with policymakers and with the public in general in communicating the economic importance and opportunity our sector has to make the case for why we need to do things differently, why further investment is warranted. And it is about investment, not out of a case of need, but out of a case of what can this sector accomplish. And I think with respect to the framework and the minister's comments, also, he spent a lot of time talking about the food security strategy, the other conditions that government is advancing. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. We really should look to see alignment between what's happening in a food security strategy, regulatory modernization, and the framework, and seize the opportunity to say, let's not curtail this discussion, focus only on BRM and the research programs in that framework. Let's talk about a vision for the sector that treats the framework as one critical element. But for the framework to really succeed regardless, I think we really need to make sure we're focused not only on what's in the envelope, but what's happening around that. And so I think there's a big task in front of us here, but I do think that the process itself sort of builds a sense of expectation. We're all used to this cycle. I don't think the statements ever get people particularly excited. It's that next level of change that we need to see. And yes, there's clearly a sense of change that's happened here in the context. And I fully agree. I would have expected to see a lot more emphasis on what's changed and what's needed to respond to that. But we're not done yet, and there is work ahead of us here to try to move the needle on, can we get some more transformative change happening? Because I do think the timelines alluded to in some of those areas in the communique will not sort of meet expectations the sector has for the urgency of some of those issues we're dealing with today.
Are you trying to tell me this isn't exciting, Scott? What are you talking about? Come on.
I will be the first to say the framework can be very exciting. I think it's very hard to get words on a paper to be exciting, which is, I think, what many people look at this statement to be. And there is that sense of expectation of some status quo. And so now I think the job is in front of us to make the case for those words on the paper need to be realized with something substantive that is exciting for the sector.
So two of the pieces of detail that did come out, and the minister mentioned them in his discussion there with Kelvin, agri-stability changes, going from 3 to 6 million per operation, and also the inclusion of farm labor or certain kinds of farm labor in some of the calculations on agri-stability. Andrea, those are details, and those were also, I think, two that the beef industry has been asking for quite some time.
Yes, they are. Yeah, so the fact that they spoke to them is positive. We'd actually asked for a $15 million cap, so 3 to 6, I mean, doubling the cap, but still not where some of our larger operations are, particularly in the feeding sector, where, ag stability is one of the key programs, especially if we have significant animal health, disease issues, trade issues, volatility. So I think we're happy to see continued improvements in that program and incremental, but it's important that we continue to also look at coverage beyond those significant, what I'd call disaster-related programs. And with volatility, one of the things producers are looking for is price management and things like livestock price insurance, which is a relatively underutilized program right now, partially because the cost of premiums, because they're not cost shared like crop insurance. And so I think that's where the statement, spoke to the fact that more equitable programs and those are things that we're going to be drilling in on now is how to do that. And I think the other thing I really want to acknowledge Scott's point of, we're trying to deal with all the provinces and territories and then all the sectors, not even just livestock and crops, but you throw in cattle versus, let's say bees as an example. Everybody has their ass. And, one of the things I think our sector is even guilty of it. We want these programs to continue to live and evolve because many of them have worked for us and are successful, like innovation and science clusters. But we also want transformative, and asking for both is what industry I think is good at, in the sense that the transformative change is things like regulatory transformation. It was a huge conversation at the panels last week, and yet really what was spoke to in the statement was pretty small and very incremental. And when we talk about, trade growth and diversification and just overall industry growth, those are the things that are really hampering industry. So I do think, to Scott's point, we need to really see more motion on that besides speaking to specific programs where they're modernizing
I,
regulation.
I can see Tyler's just chomping at the bit there.
It-
To
it-
Tyler,
yeah, because I don't want to split hairs, but I'm going to split hairs. I mean, the references to BRM that the minister talked about weren't even in the Halifax statement, right? These are not part of the directional statement for the future. The only kind of specific line about BRM, keeping in mind that it's the vast majority of the funding in the Halifax statement, is continue to improve BRM programs to be responsive and equitable to support producers to manage risks beyond their control. Like, I struggle to understand what that means. Hopefully, Andrea, to your point, it means we'll subsidize livestock price insurance premiums. I think that is, again, a relatively straightforward change that governments could be open about if they were actually considering it. The fact that they're not willing to acknowledge it, I think, is an issue. But I think there is almost this issue where we have sidelined the Halifax statement, and I worry the upcoming policy framework, and we're focusing on all of these other things around it, right? It's about the food security strategy. It's about other things, and these things do matter. I guess I'm like Scott. I can get excited about these things, and so we can all talk about all of these things around it. But the statement itself had very little reference about any kind of substantive BRM line. And Andrea, I know you probably can look at that and go, maybe this means they're considering subsidizing premiums, but how, like, I get, like, that does seem like a bit of a stretch based on the language that's in here.
so Greg, would it help if we have Andrea and Tyler mentioned this. It's not just about the diversity of the sector across the different, between the proteins and the crops and then, bees and everything else that's included. It's not just that diversity, but it is there's regionality, geographical diversity here as well. Would it assist in this process if it was more like, here's exactly what the sector needs, and we had the crop sector also saying, hey, we think livestock price insurance program and having a national program is important because those are the people that buy our crops. Like, we were a little bit more rounded out in terms of what the asks are, instead of it being like probably a list of 25 or more different things across the board.
Yeah, well, I think that should be the intent. But let me go back to some of the other comments made a bit earlier. Um, to Tyler's point, some of the parameter changes are actually in the background or they're alluded to. But when you have a vision statement, if you imagine it as marching orders for transformative change over the next 5 years, not what we're going to do in the next 12 months, even if those things are important and they should get done. But where does the sector need to go big picture? And so as you're alluding to, Shaun, having the sector speak in broader terms about what the government needs to achieve and then kind of boil it down into some action items, I think would have been a better approach. On BRM, for example, agri-stability is not working. We all know it. The coverage is low and the participation is low. But it doesn't mean that you can't fix some elements of it. The cap issue, so that it works for livestock better, is a good example where a nuts and bolts issue, we all know it needed to be changed. It should be changed, but that's not a vision. That's working at the margin where officials should be working. A bigger vision, to your point about the sector speaking in an integrated way, would have been to say we need to recast business risk management, and make sure that it's working for every sector, for large and small, that it's actually helping farmers manage the risks that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Tinkering at the margin of agri-stability is not going to do that, but setting officials a broader outcome to achieve over the next few years would have been what I expect out of a BRM discussion amongst ministers on a 5-year rolling basis. For example, let's get the private sector involved in business risk management in a much more aggressive way. Let's look at the inequities of having livestock price insurance unsubsidized and other insurance subsidized. Can we make use of better technologies and better access to data to make BRM field specific, not just sector specific, not just region specific? So I think that's an example of where vision should take the sector. And then, you spend some time and officials spend some effort trying to articulate that in the form of programming parameters and programming design. So, the other issue that I hope we don't lose sight of is the strategic risk that food affordability presents to farmers, and that's also an issue that didn't come up at all in the statement. And I think it's a strategic miss because food affordability, at some point, the risk is it comes back to the farm gate, and farmers start getting squeezed on the price of their commodities and the price of their products. To address the issue that every Canadian family is seized with today. There are some big picture things that ministers could have decided on that address food affordability, but they didn't even make the linkages between, for example, a better regulatory, faster, smarter, more modern, progressive regulatory system. How would that help lower the cost to farmers of producing our food, for example? A cold chain strategy that reduces food waste, for example, could have been something that ministers seized on big picture, and you could trace the logic model right from that kind of statement down to what gets on your table at a lower cost. And I think they missed that. And the reason I raise affordability is not just the issue of having been missed in the vision statement, but we see with these latest tariffs that our dairy sector and supply management continues to be a target of the United States. And linked to that are a lot of commentators who will draw the connection between supply management and food affordability. So there's a strategic risk when governments don't act on something as critical and as central as that. And when ag ministers in particular don't include it in their vision of where agriculture can be a problem solver. So I think that that's another example of a missed opportunity. Again, like everybody's pointed out, there's lots of time between now and the framework implementation in, I don't know, is it March 2028? So these are not things that are water under the bridge and never to be addressed again. There's all kinds of opportunity to do that. But what I haven't seen amongst ministers is the political will to do big things and to change direction in big ways.
Well, if we want to talk about other gaps, one of the biggest issues we have is access to labor throughout the sector. That not mentioned. I was at Ag in Motion for 2 days in Saskatoon this week, and there wasn't a farmer. Every single farmer that I chatted with, talking about some of the cost challenges, the overall cost complex that farmers are facing, is a real pressure on farm profitability. That is a gap and being missed. I think there's a number of things here that have not been addressed. If you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. Cassidy has one here. Tyler, maybe you want to grab it. I wonder if we're conflating stability with a lack of ambition. In an increasingly unpredictable world, is the real measure of success how different the policy is from the predecessor, or how well it provides a stable foundation for governments and industry to adapt? That's a good question, Cassidy. What are your thoughts, Tyler?
Yeah, so I think it is a good question. I mean, I think on both accounts today, the statement doesn't, like the policy framework is not succeeding. I think it's not addressing change. I don't think that there's any sign that there's any significant change. I think we even have to lower expectations to say that there's going to be incremental change based on the language that's in the agreement. I think that's, to be honest, being generous. But it's not clear to me today, given some of the things that were just talked about, that the stability that we have today is even doing that good of a job building a strong foundation that we can manage the conflict and manage the change through and adapt from. That I think that we're being generous at times, again, when we talk about the benefits of this approach. And I have heard certainly people say over the last couple of days that one of the reasons why the governments went with a status quo approach was because in this time of instability, change isn't the right solution, that this isn't the time to change. But I think that there is an ability, or there should be an ability, to advance solutions that protect the stability, that ensure that there's a good base to work from, while making those targeted changes that address some of these issues. And again, I will pick on price insurance for beef producers as a good example of something that would have been a targeted change, very timely, very responsive to what we need. And I think on the innovation side, kind of any some reference. Again, I feel like my bar has been knocked very low around what's an acceptable outcome on innovation, but a serious recommitment to build forward beyond what we've seen over the last couple of years, which have been cuts and reductions and complications in the programs. And so, sorry, yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
I just want to jump in on that because I think the biggest challenge we have is ideally you are offering stability, which means the programs that are working, we continue to use them, we continue to make incremental change, but then we make some leaps. And having the political will to do that. And I think going into this framework, everybody was set with the expectation there's no new money, budgets are tight, so pick your winners across sectors, hence why sectors are also hesitant sometimes to cooperate, because to some extent they're going in knowing there's a limited pot of money, and they're going to have to fight for it. And so I think that speaks to the fact that, as industries and government, to truly build this and make it meaningful and address both volatility and growth, which we know there's potential for growth, you have to actually position this as a nation building sector and adequately funded. And the expectations have been, no, what are your trade-offs? What are your priorities? And, as a sector, we've been told we have too many priorities, and it's trading off BRM to innovation. You don't do, because one is building your tomorrow, one is dealing with today. And that's where I think that, that kind of came to me as we're talking, in the sense that part of the whole movement into the Halifax discussion and then statement is under this auspice of a very limited budget, which is not really what's going to help in volatile markets and uncertainty.
If I could jump in on that too, I think. Oh, go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, go ahead, Scott, and then we'll go to Greg.
Yeah, I think, just speaking back to Tyler's point too about, I heard much the same. There was a sensibility around don't rock the boat when there's so much uncertainty. You're just adding to that equation. But I think one of the expectations I think industry was pushing for coming into this was that there was some semblance of real objectives and targets being set in the statement. And I think that's an area where this question of ambition and clarity around where we're going really materializes or frankly doesn't in the statement. And I think that's an area where it doesn't have to be. I'm not naive to suggest that overnight they're going to have a raft of private sector tools available to farmers, but you can set targets to say we are going to crowd in the private sector and look at where they can complement the suite we have, and task officials with heading in that direction. None of this is happening overnight. As Greg said, we're talking about March 2028 at this point for any real change here, short of the amendments to agri-stability. But other areas like predictability and expediency of our disaster response program, there's no question we know where climate risk is heading, and it's more frequency, more impact, and growing frustration on the part of industry with the way we're handling that. And not to say there's easy solutions there, but I think it's those areas where we could have really had statements that said, we are going to look at how to do better in these areas, and task officials with doing that in the build up and even through this. Because I think a point we've heard time and again recently as well is you can change BRM programs midway through a framework. We are not setting everything in concrete for 5 years. We've seen that time and again over recent years. They have tended to be on the tweak side rather than substantive reform. But there's nothing that prevents a novel product, a new idea from coming forward and spurring change midway through this. And I think we really need to seize that reality now that we are not seeing that real commitment of any clarity as to exactly what's going to change here. But I think there's a lot of room between rocking the boat and making transformative change overnight and setting a framework that says we are looking into these areas and really concertedly going to pursue change that can achieve that. And while we are adapting to the context that continues to evolve around us.
Yeah, you make me think of the saying, if not now, when? Right? Like if we're going to wait for stability and calmness to be okay, now is the time. Everything's fine. Now we're going to think big. We're going to be waiting for a very long time. Like, the ranching sector is, right now going through, a relatively good part of their, of the cycle. But if you look at the last 3 weeks of live cattle future, it's been a real challenging time. And so that whole reasoning, it kind of gets lost on me, and I think a lot of the audience as well. Greg, I'm going to jump to you. I just want to read Leonard's comment here. He agrees with your comment about food waste. He says, Leonard says, I agree with Greg. The government has few levers to pull short term to reduce food inflation, but it does have levers to pull to reduce food inflation longer term by addressing key structural issues. Cold chain logistics is one of them. I said food waste, but we're talking about food affordability. Greg, what are your thoughts?
Well, I was going to comment a bit on Andrew's observation that
Go for it.
the sector fell into a bit of a trap this time around, which was it accepted the premise that there's no new money and that you are going to fight amongst yourselves for an increasingly smaller pie. And I think I say strategic error about that posture, and not to be critical, but to remind us all that we need not play on that field alone. We can open up other fronts with governments, and namely the nation building projects that the type that the major project office is looking at in energy and critical minerals and export strategies and so forth. That's a whole new playing field. We can accept, for example, that there's a certain envelope around the fixed cost programming in the framework. But keep in mind that there's demand-driven programming built into the framework as well in the form of risk management. So, for example, one of my suggestions has been a dedicated trade risk fund like Agri-Recovery that deals explicitly with the risk that farmers cannot possibly manage in terms of the weaponization of food trade. So that you're not going begging on hand and knee to the government to help you when canola becomes the target of Chinese geopolitical strategy. You have a trade risk facility built into the framework that's demand driven. It is not a restricted envelope, and it's there explicitly to handle the kinds of trade risks that farmers are increasingly facing and have no tools with which to deal. Likewise, we should be looking as a sector, interdepartmentally, intergovernmentally, at accessing the billions, and I repeat, billions of dollars, and the very heavy shoulder behind the wheel of regulatory reform that's coming out of the major projects office. Why is agriculture not on the horizon there? And that's ministers' jobs. You go to your prime minister as Minister of Agriculture and say, I've got a problem. It looks like this, and I could be a solution to the kinds of problems that you're dealing with, Mr. Prime Minister. I don't see that that's in the statement at all, and I'm not sure that it's captured the imagination of ministers across the country. But that's a whole new envelope. It's a whole new playing field for the sector to involve itself in. Now, there's limited opportunities there, but they are big opportunities.
Okay.
And the amount of money that you're talking about available at that level dwarfs what's available over a 5-year period in the framework.
Now, I think that's a really good point, Greg, and taking that, and we know that agriculture faces a lot of cross-department issues, transportation, being an example. Tyler, at the CFA Policy Summit and Roundtable last Wednesday, there was a poll that we put on the screen during the Real Ag Radio recording, and it was the most I can't remember what the question was, but the answer that was most selected was we need a whole government approach. Now, you pushed back on that. We'll get back to that in a second, because that might be in conflict with what we just heard there from Greg. Barry asked the question, can agriculture ministers drive change that is outside their mandate? Examples is regulations, CFIA, export development. Most of ag current holdbacks is not under the direct influence of agriculture. This gets back to this whole government question. Tyler, what are your thoughts there?
Sorry, can I just jump in, Tyler? I'm sorry to do this
Go
to
ahead.
you, but But I worked for an ag minister who appointed himself the junior minister of transportation and seized, that file in collaboration with his colleague. But ag ministers have an enormous amount of weight if they want to exert it. And I think this is a time to see ministers jointly say we need to exert that influence.
Thanks.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Tyler.
Yeah, no, that's
A good point.
That's okay, Greg. And again, I had some experience working for that same minister too. But I think that when I opposed this and disagreed with this at the CFA meeting, it's not that I disagree with ag needing a whole of government approach. Yes, we need a whole of government approach. As the comments made, we need to understand where we're at on regulatory reform, on trade, on infrastructure. I fully agree with that. But the policy framework is not a whole of government policy framework. The policy framework is something that is signed by the federal agriculture minister and his provincial and territorial agriculture minister counterparts. And I would like to focus on what are the things that they can do within their mandate, within this framework, to deliver change at the end of the day, rather than getting caught up in all of these things that fall outside of the framework. Those things still need to be addressed. The framework should be connected to other things that are going on. It should connect to the federal food security strategy. We should see that at the end of the day. But I think that we get caught up trying to make the framework things that it's not and miss the opportunity to get change within the framework at the end of the day.
I would disagree with you there, Tyler. I'm sorry to say that.
I like
but
friction. This is good, Greg. You go.
There's no friction, just a gentle person's disagreement. The ministers have the opportunity within their statement to say jointly we are going to exert a stronger, broader influence, and let's work together to exercise that opportunity. It doesn't mean that they can dictate to the rest of government, but this is why I'm saying I think there's an opportunity for ministers to talk about agriculture as a nation-building sector right now, especially under the terms and conditions in which geopolitically and economically we're working right now. So you're absolutely right. The vision statement can't say we're taking over government, but it can say we're jointly as ministers going to work towards a broader, more focal impact of agriculture and agriculture policy across governments.
So just a quick response to that. I think that that's right. And I've long said that I would like to see agriculture ministers develop a shared infrastructure priority list, right? That's clearly not within their mandate, but they should, as ministers, be able to get together and say, here are the 5 projects that really matter to agriculture and food in Canada. And then they could all share that with their counterparts. Again, these are, in my mind, are relatively simple things, but they seem to be beyond what we can get out of the FPT table today.
Well, and to me, what Tyler just said is where I see the connection point between, the two disagreements here, or disagreeing sides, is I think you can set, again, hearkening back to this point about setting objectives. Those objectives can bleed beyond the programs and the exact explicit function of those and say, there's a really powerful tool in the framework, and that is, to the minister's comment about unity, coordination. We have FPT ministers coming together routinely, identifying shared priorities and working towards achieving those. And I think one of the areas that we were looking to see some reflection on is what is the function the framework can play in connective tissue to some of those other instruments? Is it about creating space for more effective eligibility criteria? We've seen commitments through the Strategic Response Fund, through other pieces, and we've heard in the follow-up to that the sector feels like they're a round peg being put into a square hole, and there's still issues there. And I think there is a function for ag officials and ag departments and ag ministers in particular to help smooth those edges and find a way to bring the sector more concertedly into some of those opportunities that can emerge, because to Greg's point, they aren't many, but they are significant. And if we can just get a better interface to see ag profiled as a nation building exercise, positioning us as a superpower on food moving forward, there's potential to see some of those. And I think that's where I would hearken back to that point about needing to set clarity of objectives and priorities that are external facing. They're not about status quo or how the programs are working internally. It's what are we trying to achieve with a framework and how do we get there? And things like cold chain logistics, there is potential to address that through something like a food security strategy, but that's where that point about alignment is so critical. And I do think coming out of this, yes, the food security strategy came late in the day. I think we all recognize those statements are largely drafted well before that meeting happens. But we need to really focus on how do we leverage what's out there and do more with the sum of the parts than just treat all of these as isolated interventions that don't build to something greater.
Yeah, and that, the connective tissue and how a lot of these things all relate to each other. I think that's actually the part that's missing. Andrew, I would like your thoughts on it. We talked about how it's missing maybe cross department in the government, but it also happens at the ag association level across stakeholders as well. And this is outside of this discussion, but I think of in the early days of the push for ethanol, there's a lot of pushback from the livestock sector because, hey, we're competing for that corn or that feedstock, right? And we found out that, man, these DDGs are actually very useful to the livestock sector, and that is kind of now not as anywhere near or close to an issue at all. So what's your thoughts on what's been discussed here, Andrea?
Well, I think to Greg's point, I mean, there is a lot of firepower or in other government departments that agriculture needs to or could potentially leverage. And it also ups the profile if they start thinking, well, how does agriculture factor into that when they're thinking about things? As a sector, that's a very daunting process. I mean, our sector has delved into it somewhat as we deal with things like environment and suddenly environmental goods and services, and you need to deal with ECCC on that. And when you look at sector specific approaches, they're very program specific. There's a lot of learning, there's a lot of bureaucracy. And it's mostly how do we fit that square peg into the round hole that meets the objectives of that department. And I think that's where, ministers have an opportunity to change that dynamic and that dialogue and really influence change in terms of how agriculture engages with across departments and move things forward in a meaningful manner. And it does mean coordination across the sectors in terms of priorities, but we've spent enough time as sectors always talking, and there's shared priorities always. I mean, yes, livestock's or cattle's going to have a specific list that canola's not going to agree with, but I can guarantee there's a few that we absolutely agree on, and we understand the benefits to each other. And so I think that's where being a bit more ambitious or a lot more ambitious as ministers to provide leadership to build across other sectors, it doesn't deplete or diminish the ag policy framework and what that needs to be done, but it does kind of move us from use ag policy framework from a stability and incremental piece while also growing over here.
There's a comment here from Dallas, who says picking winners has largely been the problem. Government in general has been unsuccessful in its past directions. One suggestion may be to scrap many programs, fund farm groups directly, and let them administer funds regionally according to local regional needs. The whole government approach is a large snowball to push up a hill that may likely never happen. Scott, what are your thoughts about that comment?
Well, I think there's a lot in that. I mean, I think certainly, and I'd love to hear Greg's perspective on that as someone who was a deputy working in this space before, because I think one of the checks and balances is always measurability. How can you demonstrate where money's going and how it's being used? And I think there's a question there, but I think certainly like the thread of that or the theme behind it is something I think industry was suggesting as well, is we need to be focused on sector development with a lot more flexibility with how funds are being used. It's one thing to say we're going to move money from undersubscribed areas to oversubscribed. It's another to say we're going to change the meritocracy or the way we're looking at what is a viable investment in a project, and really focusing on empowering the industry to highlight their priorities and say, here's the outcome we're going to achieve. This fits with the priorities you've articulated in your vision, and give a little more license for that to happen. So I think there's a real core concept that's in that is a critically important one. But I would say I think it is around moving away from rigidity, getting to a place where we're willing to explore alternative service delivery, different ways of doing things. And I think that is what we really are all hinting at here, is what needs to be done. Is it's not just about innovation for innovation's sake or modifying what's there. It's about looking at how we actually fundamentally change the way we do some of these things to accommodate the fact that the world is changing, the industry is changing, and there is a need to really invest in some of those growth areas in particular. And that doesn't always equate to the measures and the performance indicators that we've relied on that are often quite transactional and sort of internal to the policy framework itself.
Can I just jump in there
Andrew,
for a minute? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
go ahead.
I don't think, there is programs that can be scrapped, and especially like we know there's undersubscribed ones, there's oversubscribed ones, or we call them underfunded. But I think within those programs, though, that's where allowing industry to take more leadership is really important. So it's not necessarily scrapping the programs, it's allowing, and you know, we use innovation as an example where we have a 5-year strategy, we had an innovation plan, we put forward, you know, a suite of projects under the cluster, and we're told you can fund these ones, but even though these ones are high priority for industry, we're not going to fund them because they're not a priority for government. And that felt weird from an industry standpoint where industry knows what they need. We're not putting checkoff dollars into research that we don't want. And so I think, you know, we need to move up to that higher level where, yes, if industry has a strategy and it's clear and there's outcomes that are measurable, government can take less of a hands-on approach. And absolutely, it's taxpayer money. We need to be accountable for that. But do we need to be as prescriptive as what was previously done under other frameworks? That's, I think, the question for us.
We're starting to get votes from the webinar audience on who is right, Greg or Tyler. Roger provides his input. Thanks, Roger. Greg and Tyler's perspectives are both valid, but I think the strongest outcomes will be driven by Greg's approach. Ag is food. So there you go, Greg. You got a vote. Tyler, something that
comment on that, you know, to my comments about, you know, ag taking a bigger seat at the table. If you thought that one sector or one federal department couldn't influence very fundamentally the policies and directions of other parts of government, you need only look at the last 10 years at environment policy, which fundamentally dominated energy policy and tax policy. So, not in the ways that we would have wanted, of course. But the point being that you can exert an influence on all of government or whole of government with the right strategy and with the right coordination.
You know, I want to remind everybody too, ag is not just food as well. It is also, you know, is also feed. It is fuel. It is also fiber. And we need to think more holistically than just agriculture being food. Tyler, I know something you and I have chatted a lot about is the farm management skills. And I know that Heather Watson, she put a question in here from Farm Management Canada, made me think of this, is that, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, managing risk and, you know, these unprecedented times and all these kinds of things, but we're trying to help provide resiliency to some of the outcome, but maybe we need to start a little bit earlier in the chain, and there needs to be more talk about farm management, farm financial competency as entrepreneurs and things like that. I think that was also one of the gaps here.
Well, and the good news is that one of the things in the statement is that they will advance proactive risk management and climate adaptation. Again, I guess it's good that it's there. Not clear to me what that actually means or what governments intend by that statement. Hopefully, it means supporting some more proactive risk management. Hopefully, that's part of what they intend there. But again, I think that in all of this, to go back to kind of whether or not Greg or I are winning, the actual answer is we've both lost, right? The statement does not do whole of government, and the statement does not do meaningful change within the policy framework. At the end of the day, neither of us have won, and so we are now shifting, or we should now be shifting into, okay, what does implementation look like? And as much as, again, you can look at the language around proactive risk management, you can look at the language around equitable BRM. It's not clear to me how any of this gets, or like, what is the avenue to say, okay, what we want is this to translate into price insurance premium subsidies. What we want is this to translate into more support for proactive risk management that looks like X, Y, or Z. And I think that this is part of the gap that we fall into, is that, again, we'll now continue to fight kind of yesterday's battle all of the time. The reality is it's probably too late, and I wish governments were a lot more honest and transparent about this. It's probably too late to make meaningful change for April 1st, 2028 anyways. And again, the statement was largely written before their consultations opened. I think that we all kind of fall into a bit of this charade that goes on around this, and we missed the opportunity to kind of throw that out the window and say, okay, no, here's what we want to focus on. If we're going to talk about implementation, here are 5 very prescriptive things that we're looking for. To Andrea's point, we should have one innovation program, right? Like that should be a low hanging bar to get to. But yet it's not even clear to me that there's a process or a path to even get to that point either.
Okay, so I'll go to Andrea first, and I want to hear what Scott has to say. One of the questions that I have, because we keep on saying, like, you know, I don't know how many panels in the last 2 years, everybody, that I have moderated, where it's all about, you know, how do we make agriculture a superpower? How do we achieve, like, we've been having this conversation for so long, and we're doing it again to ourselves. We're yes, the answer is yes to all of that. It's the action component of it. Andrea, I wonder if it would be better if more of this debate wasn't in closed rooms and it was more out in the open, and there was a little bit more transparency about how the different provinces felt. And I was making fun of Greg and Tyler's friction, but, you know, iron sharpens iron. And to have a better understanding about what are we actually trying to do here, besides creating a MBA speak sort of, here's the pillars of importance, and doing a keyword drop. What are your thoughts on the process of that?
That's a difficult question. You know, I feel like agriculture is almost the underestimated younger sibling right now in Canada. Like, it's, you know, there's a lot of potential. We know that, but it's getting it beyond that vortex. And, you know, I don't know if it's the existing format for the policy framework. I think that's a bigger question in terms of, you know, to Minister MacDonald's point, perhaps these meetings should be more regular, and perhaps they should be encompassing of other departments, and bring together some of that to profile that. I mean, we talk about our experience with the ECCC, Transport Canada's been brought up. Like, all of these departments have linkages, and I think sometimes we've talked about it with Canada Border Services and you know, animal health and risk, and you know, you write a letter and it's a vortex where there's conversations at a ministerial level need to be happening. So I don't think the current format, even being more transparent, is what fixes it. It's a totally different format in terms of it. We had the beef value chain roundtable and the ag roundtables under the previous governments, and you know, it speaks to that, where you're bringing together cross sectors, and in this case cross government, that actually needs to happen, in my view. But Scott, please help me on that answer.
Yeah, I'm glad you were asked that one first. That's a tricky one. There's a few things I would say there. I think one, I think there's no question we've seen transparency erode over successive frameworks in the way this discussion has played out. I think I recall years ago seeing a very clear trajectory in the statements where farmers were positioned as partners in the early frameworks, and increasingly we are on the outside sort of foisting in our ideas and hoping they resonate, but really not privy to the discussions that are happening at that table. And I can't attest to being around that table in 2003 and 2007 to say what that looked like in practice, but it does feel very much like a increasingly opaque process. Saying that, I think so much of what we're talking about here, and it's not a conversation to be had just with ministers, we really need to seize the center of government with this concept. And that is where I think when I look at the food security strategy, we can debate how landmark an investment that was and how much that money is going to translate into meaningful change. But there's no question the Prime Minister's office was somewhat seized with that. And I think there's a signal of intent there, if nothing else, that they actually looked at something approaching industrial policy for our sector with a sense of the importance our sector has. And I think where we really need to lean moving forward is on being able to quantify and articulate not just the economic import of our sector, because I think even in the chat, I've seen everyone rhyme off the stats that demonstrate how significant agriculture is. We need to be able to say what the opportunity is for policy prescriptions and say, if this happens, here's the growth potential our sector can achieve, and here's the benefits it will afford socially, economically, and environmentally. And that's a common challenge to the industry and to ag ministers as well, is to make that case to the center. And I think that really is where this needs to start, because at the end of the day, all of the expenditures under a framework, you have to go to Treasury Board, you have to get all those checks and balances. And if you're not building the case with the centers of government, you're still having an insular discussion in the ag industry or the ag sector writ large otherwise.
But I think,
Yeah, Tyler, before I go to you, just one thing. To the point of the stats, Graham says in response to Greg, primary ag is 1.4% of GDP, food processing is 1.6, food retail is 1.6, and food service is 1.4, according to AFC. Tyler, go ahead.
I think one of the things though that Scott that requires is analysis on government's part that understands what those opportunities are. And I think one of the things that's worth acknowledging that isn't often acknowledged is that I don't think government does that analysis anymore. If you go back to what it looked like in the past, you can see discussion papers that governments released at the beginning of the process. We know that there were forums, there were public presentations around what's there. We know that there was significant internal analysis done that spoke to the context facing the sector. I would love if someone from Ag Canada or Provincial Department is listening and has done this analysis and would like to prove me wrong, for them to take the opportunity to tell me that I'm wrong. But it's not clear to me that that analysis is done to start the process with. It's not clear to me that governments have a good sense as to what that is or what that looks like. And I think that again gets into some of the challenges that exist today, is that it does not appear like that serious, thoughtful analysis that starts this off, that frames the context, that sets up other changes, even happens anymore. It certainly doesn't happen publicly, right? I think we all can agree that does not exist. If you look at the discussion kind of framing for the consultation that happened, there's no meaningful analysis there. But it's not clear to me that it happens behind closed doors either.
Well,
Greg,
maybe just harkening back to
go
my
ahead,
last
Scott.
point. Sorry, Shaun, to jump over you there. But I mean, that was one of the things that I think was somewhat, and I won't say it was deep in any respect, but the food security strategy showed some degree of analysis of the context. And I think that was one of those areas where it sparked some excitement on my part, certainly, was that there was some thoughtfulness around what is happening in our sector and where some of the future needs to head to shore up the sector against some of the variables we're dealing with right now and those pressures the sector is facing. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. Like across the board, I would say this is common, not just in Ag Canada and one province, or it's sort of endemic across governments these days, is we're seeing a lot less public visioning analysis documents about sort of certain sectors and where they're heading. But at the same time, we are seeing some glimmers of hope in the broader ecosystem here. And I think we can't lose sight of that altogether. There are things that are happening, whether it's on red tape reduction, we are seeing that happen at a pace we have not. And we can all, again, talk about what our expectations are and whether they're too low in that regard. But there is, I mean, elements of analysis happening here that are suggesting there's some thoughtfulness about our sector. I think we really need to seize that. And I think the unfortunate reality is we've talked time and again about the sector coming together and saying 5 policy prescriptions, do these 5 things, and that's going to move the needle. The reality as a group that is really seized with convening the sector together is that the more you bring together, the watered down that message gets. And that's the challenge we always face, is to the point Andrea raised earlier. What are those 5 or 6 things that everyone can buy into that actually, you know, it might not be for me, but I can see the forest for the trees here and there's a net benefit to the whole sector. And I think it's that challenge we as a sector need to seize right now too, and think about, can we really put some water in our wine collectively and agree these are the things that if those happened, it's a signal, it's a trajectory change that moves us all collectively in a direction where we can benefit.
Greg, I'll throw this to you. Daniel's got a question. How problematic is the rural versus urban divide in achieving a pragmatic and effective ag policy?
Urban and rural settings, right? So I don't know that there's necessarily a natural schism between urban and rural environments when you're talking about agriculture policy, especially if you bring it down to food. I take your point earlier, Shaun, about food, fiber, fuel, it really being the agricultural opportunity. But I think if you think about food and food security, you've got a pretty broad base of potential buy-in, regardless of urban or rural demographic. I think the other side of the coin is, from an export engine point of view, agriculture really is one of Canada's preeminent opportunities. Whether that's food processed items or commodities, there's opportunity for both urban and rural to participate. the other thing I think we often forget, I think somebody in the comment in the question area mentioned it, but food manufacturing is, I think, amongst the biggest, if not the biggest, manufacturing sector in Canada. And in some urban environments, it's the only manufacturing sector left. So, there's opportunity right across the board. And maybe the peanut butter spread a little deeper in some areas than others. But the value add in the food chain from farm to fork, whether that's in Canada or abroad, the opportunity and the value add is huge.
Can I jump in there on
Yeah,
that
go
one
ahead.
just quickly,
Yep.
Shaun?
Yep.
I think this deviates even farther, Tyler, from talking about the ag policy framework, but I think it's an important one. The rural urban divide, where we really see it, is the fact that as a sector, we're being challenged to grow bigger, be more intensive, to use innovation, to adapt. And while we understand the technology and the need to do that, that's where we often see the divide really cause challenges. I live in an area where intensive livestock is a thing, and biodigesters are a way to turn manure into energy, and yet it doesn't feel so comfortable for the urban around. And, the smell is also an issue. And when we look at those things in the US, they're approving those systems much quicker, much faster, and it involves municipal, provincial, and federal approvals, which that gauntlet. And so when we talk regulatory modernization, the words that I see in the framework, it doesn't address that in the sense that our industry is going to have to move that road. And while I think consumers are comfortable with food, when we talk about technology, that's where we tend to have challenges with it. And knowing that as an industry, they feel very comfortable with the local producer and the local farmer, but they don't necessarily feel comfortable with a sector that wants to grow and diversify and export and needs to, bring along technology and change.
And I think if I could jump in
Go ahead.
quickly, Shaun,
Yep.
just building on Andrea's point, I think, when we were trying to convene the sector around with those priorities, where part of that was the food processing sector that Greg alluded to. And I think so much of their interest here was on red tape reduction. I mean, really, to move the needle on the
Mm-hmm.
investment climate, that's such a fundamental part. And again, that's where I would, point back to what Greg raised earlier about the collective clout ag ministers can have. And if there was a coordinating function about articulating regulatory priorities and looking at how that happens across the orders of government and working with their counterparts to drive that, I think that was, if there was one omission in the text of that statement that really didn't reflect where industry was looking for, it was that point about red tape reduction and seizing the potential they have to drive some of that reform. Because I think that really is, at the end of the day, the amount of funding in the policy framework envelope itself is a drop in the bucket for capital modernization and those sorts of things for the food processing sector. But where it could play a role in supporting the broader value chain is so fundamentally red tape reduction and making sure we have a regulatory environment that's conducive to investment.
And I think, Shaun, I think where I would take the rural urban divide back into the policy framework context, but I think this applies broadly, and it reflects a comment that was in the chat as well. It's less about, I think, yes, there are clearly political issues, so don't want to I think that there's a more fundamental issue of the people that are in ag departments today don't actually have experience in the sector. I think they tend to be government policy people. They're probably very good horizontal policy managers. But John Simpson had an op-ed in the Hill Times yesterday on the policy framework and talked about the need to articulate better outcomes. And again, it's something that we haven't talked about, but I think we would all probably agree. One of the things that was missing from the statement that should be in there, as Scott talked about accountability earlier, but is some sense as to what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve with all of this. It's not clear to me today that governments have the capacity to clearly articulate what outcomes they want to achieve. And I think it speaks to this reality that the people that are around these tables that are making these decisions aren't just grounded. And I often say that doesn't mean that you need to have kind of poop on your boots in order to be engaged in these issues. But there is a lack of depth and experience that I do think is a barrier to progress at the end of the day that we do probably need to acknowledge more often.
We are at a time. This went very fast. I do appreciate the great participation from the audience and your questions and your thoughts and participation. This is how we move this discussion forward for sure. Greg, Scott, Andrea, thank you so much for providing your insights and perspectives. And we'll definitely be. This is not over. We got a lot of work to do yet, as we kind of found out here today. So thank you to the three of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Okay, Tyler. We'll just finish up the two of us quickly before we sign off. It's become clear that we're still kind of a little bit stuck in first gear here a little bit, and we need to kind of ramp up, and the industry needs to push people in the direction to the outcome that is ultimately people are searching for.
And I think a clear message that we need to look at to implementation, and we need to look to details. I think we saw that in the first poll. Too early to tell what people think of the agreement. But I think that what we've heard is that there's some hard work ahead, getting everybody on board and focused on implementation. But I think if we look at the number of participants that were attended, the questions that we got in the chat, clearly this is a topic that people are interested in. And so stay tuned as we look at how do we do a better job answering some of the questions that we didn't get to today. But also how do we make sure that we keep doing the work that we need to do to make sure that we're dealing with these implementation issues now that we're past this meeting.
Cool, Tyler. Well, I'll let you sign off with the final thoughts.
Well, again, it is just to thank Greg and Scott and Andrea for taking part. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Shaun. And please do take the opportunity to register for the CAPI conference this October. Take the opportunity also to sign up for CAPI's newsletter. Go to realagriculture.com to sign up for the content there. Stay tuned for our next webinar. Thank you all for being with us today.